back to the next episode of Don't Fear the Wait with me. As per usual, you know who I am, so I'm not going to bother reintroducing myself as the TinyTitan. But thank you once again for joining us on a brand new episode. Today I have a wonderful guest who is kind of taking up the whole screen just to basically prove the fact that I am just as small as I am, because he's huge. And the reason why he is huge is because he works exceedingly hard, and this is a reason as to why I brought him on the podcast today. In the hot seat, I have Mr. Nick Gloff. Nick, how are you, my lovely?
Doing pretty well. Happy to be here.
Good. I'm very, very pleased. It was really, really cool actually, because just as you were coming on board and I was letting you into the Zoom waiting room, I was just having a flick through our Instagrams, and I noticed that you were doing an extraordinarily heavy front squat. And I had the tagline about it saying, you know, don't get so wound up about people saying that you're not working hard enough, because you probably aren't. And that's one of the reasons why I brought you on here today. So I actually thought that it was quite a funny tale just to kind of flick through and see you do that. But we'll get onto that in a minute. So Nick, for people who don't know who you are, can you just give us a little bit of a rundown and introduce yourself?
Sure. The name is Nick Gloff. I've lived my entire life in the United States, originally from New York, now living in Florida. So that was a very recent move over the last couple of months. I moved here to be part of Team Camp Jansen.
Cool.
Which, for anybody that's deep into the bodybuilding world, knows who Matt Jansen is. Cool. So me, a friend of mine who is actually within the room with me, a roommate of mine, Matt Berzicott, coaches for Coach Matt Jansen, along with Nadia Samanowicz and Justin Jacoby. So we are part of a coaching team for Matt Jansen. That's kind of what I do here. Also sponsored athlete with Raw and Revive, which are companies out of Florida here. I've trained for the last 10 years of my life. So, but don't let that fool you. I'm actually only 23.
Oh my God, right, okay.
Yeah. So freshly out of college as well. So I went to school upstate New York for kinesiology, exercise science double major, minored in biology while I was there, worked in a biomechanics lab for 2 years while I was there. Cool. So ran some research on some EMG, ACEs, isokinetic dynamometer type stuff, working on rate of force development research. Just small part of my background. Been coaching, mentoring for probably about 4 or 5 years now.
Okay.
And everything's been a little bit more serious in the last year or so, ever since having gotten out of school and kind of started on my own path forward. So for the most part, I think that's it for an introduction.
That's good. That's cool. What made you want to actually join up with Matt instead of just kind of going off on your own? I just thought that would be a nice insight into why you fancy teaming up rather than having a solo career.
Well, I had a little bit of a solo to start with over the last year prior to this, but Matt is somebody that I've always looked up to in the coaching industry, and with especially the athletes that he's worked with over the last 5-10 years-ish.
For sure.
He's done a really good job of being able to get people that are middle-level amateurs and just turning them into like standing in the ranks of pro shows almost immediately within a year or two after getting a pro card and working with him in the first place. So something that I didn't have in my own repertoire already as a coach was knowing all the steps that you go through to take those guys that are close and on the cusp and already have their everything together and bringing them to a higher level than you can imagine they could in a very short period of time. So being a part of, you know, just being with him and in the same area, because actually he lives down here in Florida too. We're all in the same vicinity, train at the same gym at the Revive HQ.
Cool.
Being around people that know that little bit extra, that have been around for decades now, that have been doing all the things that through experience I'd have to learn on my own and only on my own by making the mistakes that you'd have to. I can expedite the process of getting a lot better at what I do as an athlete myself, and then as a coach, being around these types of people. So it was really a pretty easy decision to come onto the team with Matt, especially when you're a kid from Western New York out of nowhere and you get a call from Matt Jansen, you pick it up.
Well, yeah, this is very true. You're not going to decline that one. Not going to ghost Matt Jansen.
No.
Okay, nice one. So realistically then, if that's actually quite a nice segue into why I brought you on here for our conversation realistically, because I wanted to have a chat with you about some optimal training modalities and strategies. So one thing that really kind of sparked my interest was that everybody is looking for the quick fix. Everybody is looking to the road to the pro show realistically, but as quick as they can make it. So what, in your point of view, realistically, would you say is, I mean, let's start from somebody who just comes to you, who's got all of their shit together. They know how to tick the boxes, but then you look at them and you're like, okay, so you're off season. This is what I think that has been going wrong. Have you got a viewpoint on what you're seeing nowadays in the industry is what people are doing wrong?
The majority of the time when I have somebody fresh that comes to me, the biggest thing for literally everybody that I've had, aside from maybe like, I could cut off a few fingers and still only count them on one hand.
Yeah.
That I've had come to me, that I can actually look through their movements and see that they're putting adequate effort in and doing them efficiently. I mean, that's from very beginner level all the way up to what you would consider an advanced trainee.
Right.
So just from my own background and the kind of the eye that I've tried to develop for myself, looking at movements so much, and basically my entire formal and continuing education after college has been all about movement. Building up that look to see what people are doing right and wrong in their training itself is usually the thing that people don't think about as much.
Right.
Once you've gone through the beginner stages of going through movements, like as a beginner, unless your ego is so incredibly inflated that you think that you're doing everything right from day one, you're going to be more willing to change your patterns and think about like, think critically and look at what you're doing and decide whether or not it's right, because you're trying to just get your feet under you. But beyond that beginner stage, nobody thinks about what they're doing with their movement anymore. Whatever they learned as a beginner, those patterns that get set in, they just stop questioning why they do the things they do. And after that point, it all becomes habit.
Right.
And a lot of the time, they haven't really honed in on all the specific details that need to be there for every single rep of every single movement of every single session to actually be additive to them. It's just a thing that they do. And then they try to move all of the other variables in every other way around that. So already their execution of everything isn't where it's supposed to be. Their effort, therefore, just following the fact that they're not very efficient, their effort is bottlenecked by the fact that they're not efficient. Right. So that's already a problem. And that's a variable that's present within every movement that they do, no matter how they mix up their sessions, how they periodize their movements, what kind of intensity techniques they use, doesn't matter. You can move all of the other toggle switches in the training setup. And if those two things are not there the way they're supposed to be, everything else is wrong anyway. You could have the most intelligently designed volume periodized program with the movements getting rotated at the perfect times, deloads, every single thing that you could possibly do for a larger macro structure of training could all be picture perfect, beautiful. Doesn't matter because the quality of the effort on every single day isn't adding up to what it should be. And then beyond that, aside from people that you would say know everything that they're doing and they're consistent enough to tick the boxes, if they don't know how to make the decisions for themselves and they haven't been coached prior to, there's often just some big missing holes in just basic nutrition and lifestyle management. Lifestyle management typically is a big problem for most people. So that's usually the first thing to look at. But those would be the things that I'd say are the biggest mistakes. People not taking a close enough eye on what they're doing on the day-to-day, questioning what their foundations already were, and then not taking care of all the things outside of the gym floor and getting a little bit too anal about the things that don't matter as much.
Yeah, see, I've noticed that quite a lot. People are starting to major in the minors, realistically, and just hone in on these really tiny details when actually the big groundwork isn't where it needs to be at this point.
Yep.
So when you talk about like lifestyle, are you talking about daily stresses or literally just kind of routine that people just cannot get into?
Routine. And for the most part, what I'm referring to is sleep patterns.
Yeah.
And the frequency of eating.
Oh, okay. So this is an interesting one, right? Because nutrition is my bag. I absolutely love nutrition, and I'm so passionate about it. So just like you are with kinesiology and movements, I'm exactly the same with nutrition. Now, I am a big, big, big fan of more frequent feedings. One, because of maximizing muscle protein synthesis, of course, but also because of the digestive issues that you can have in relation. That is an amazing mug, by the way. I just wanted to shout that out. That's a cool mug. Guys, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you're missing out because that is a far out mug. But yeah, sorry, moving on from that side of thing, I was distracted by your beauty there. So I'm a big fan of frequency of feedings, and I do carry on spouting this when I talk about it on my Instagram, my socials and things like that. However, I do get hit quite a lot by saying it doesn't really matter because of thermogenesis, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. Yeah. So let's have your viewpoint on it then. So I'm not the only crazy person spouting that.
Well, we could go science all day with it, but really just to be practical about it, if you're trying to get in all the food that you'd have to be a large person, you're going to have to split it up more than a couple of times.
Yeah.
I mean, I've made the mistake and have continued to make the same mistake at times where just other lifestyle things just don't work. You're trying to balance everything in the world and it doesn't quite work out for you. You try to eat all the food you have to in 3 meals when you're supposed to have 6. It's terrible.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a horrible experience. And you're stuffed for multiple hours on end and you don't want to eat the next meal anyway. For the same amount of food, you split it up into much smaller amounts, have it a couple hours apart, you're going to be slightly hungry by the time you get to your meals, as long as your calories are moderately okay, especially if you're in somewhat of a surplus or maintaining. Try to put it all in at once. It doesn't go as well.
No.
Just practically speaking, that's all that needs to really be said. And to be honest, I'm in the same page as you with like just the annoyance of this like nihilism that we have about everything now, which has been this weird turn of events that's happened from everybody going super sciencey about everything. Where my background, and don't get me wrong, my background is in hard science.
Sure.
That's what I went to school for. That's what I did all my continuing ed looking into. So I'm not saying that there's nothing important about knowing the hard facts and the data and looking at what's current. We're really having a foundation in the actual base knowledge of physiology and anatomy for you to make your decisions. That's fair, well, and good. And I do that myself, practice what I preach as far as that's concerned.
Yeah.
But through getting so tied up in just the word of the science as if it's gospel, it's now become like this weird nihilism that we're seeing that, okay, within this range of these variables, whatever we're talking about, meal frequency, the just frequency of protein feedings, whether or not a pre or a post-workout nutrition actually matters that much in the grand overall for the total hypertrophy you get over a period of time, or even just the volume studies, like how much is enough for X person that could be 6 sets per week, 27 sets per week. Within this range, which is really what the science tends to say on everything, because we don't really nail on the head, like, nope, this is exactly it. Here's your ticket, just do this and everything's fine. It's always a range that we find on every variable we ever study. And within that range, that's where we start getting like these permissive statements of going, okay, well, I guess it doesn't even matter. So we just kind of throw it at the wall and I guess it's going to work.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a confusing thing where we have so much specificity in our statements because of like being so science-based, but all of the science-based statements leading to the conclusion of, well, basically nothing matters, you can do anything. But no. No, it's a mischaracterization of the data that we have, because you can simplify it down to that point. That doesn't necessarily mean that statement's entirely true, because you just washed away all the nuance that made the statement worth saying in the first place.
For sure.
So yeah, it's just the state of the world we're in right now, which is kind of a weird trend.
It is a weird trend, and it is, there are so many people out there who either like Camp Science or Camp Anecdote, and it's like I've always been in that crossover phase where it's like you should just have a combination of the two, because look at the bros back in the day. they didn't have all of this science. They didn't have access to EMG data. They didn't have access to digestive studies, etc., etc. But you know what? They just got their head down and cracked on, and they didn't need specific motivations. They just kind of went, no, do you know what? I want to get big, so I'm just going to get big the best way that I know how. And that's what they did. And yes, okay, they may not have had the most efficient movement patterns. They may not have had the most efficient diet or health markers or anything like that, or even access to anabolics, but they still made it pretty well, and they've still taught us a thing or two. So the fact is that science is always going to evolve. We just have to kind of take bits and pieces from all camps, I suppose, right?
Mm-hmm. And we tend to, over the years, all the things that the bros used to say, that the science people said, there's no evidence for that. We slowly find that there is evidence for that. Yeah. And they just keep on getting proved more right over time. So that's another thing that I don't quite understand about the extreme fanaticism over the science, is that the science is supposed to be developing over time. Whatever answer you have now isn't the final answer. Over time, that final answer is just going to get more and more clear, but never fully clear. There's always going to be another piece to add into it. That's the beauty of the science.
For sure.
The beauty of science is it never gives you an answer. It just tells you how wrong you are at any one period of time. So you can get a little bit less wrong over time.
Exactly.
So that's just a little bit of a commentary on just where we kind of are and the missing pieces in the way that we're thinking about things at the moment, where we really should be pulling from both sides a whole lot more than we do. And instead of picking a hill to die on and then just going to war with the people on the other side all the time, we could probably just ask each other some questions and see if the things that we think on the science side and the things we think on the anecdote side might actually work the same way if we just get past the language of it and the ego of trying to be right all the time.
Oh, for sure. I absolutely love that. I love the fact as well that people just kind of either think anecdote or science. So let's go anecdote, this worked for me. Science, well, the book says this. And it's like, well, actually, are we treating our clients, or are we treating each other as actual individuals? Because people aren't books and people aren't all the same. It's like your particular movements, for example, it's like your front squat, right? That was on your Instagram just now. Yep. It's incredible. I think it's absolutely astronomical. But there's no way that particular movement would work for me. So if you were programming me, especially with knee wraps, oh my God, I hate knee wraps. I really do.
Yeah. But I'm not the biggest fan either, but
no, absolutely not. Why do you use wraps instead of sleeves? Just so, I mean, obviously I know so you can lift heavier and stuff, but is there a particular point where you moved from sleeves to wraps?
Yeah, I actually periodize them.
Okay, that's cool.
So it's not just been like an absolute shift from sleeves to wraps. It's been, the way that I look at wraps for bodybuilding is start off when you're actually wrapping them, you wrap them differently than you would for powerlifting.
Right.
You want to still be able, like, actually, because I more recently put up a video of myself actually doing a wrap.
Yeah.
And showing how it is that I actually do that. And while doing the wrap for bodybuilding, you should be able to wrap it yourself to start with.
Yeah.
You shouldn't need to have a partner. You don't need to have enough leverage to pull it that tight. You don't. So the difference, major difference other than just the style of wrapping, would be that you make it loose enough that you can actually body weight squat all the way into the bottom without having major discomfort. So that's the first distinction. So really, it's not something where you should be walking on like peg legs for you to get all the way to the bar. You should be able to squat pretty freely and not have any pain doing so. Where if anybody's had any sort of experience with wraps before, if you wrap them the way you're technically supposed to wrap them, they're excruciatingly painful while you're just standing there.
Oh, absolutely.
Or sitting there without any pressure on your legs whatsoever. So there should be only enough resistance so that very, very bottom point that you land into has just enough accommodation that you know that you can initiate movement back upwards. Having just enough support where you have, actually very similarly to a sleeve, where the sleeve with the compression doesn't add literally anything. The compression doesn't really help you. The temperature of the joint really doesn't help you beyond the fact that it's already warmed up and doing the pattern. So those really aren't my concerns. But when you're in the very bottom, what actually helps you with the sleeve is just the amount of thickness that you have crossing each other as you hit the bottom. So that thickness of the padding behind your calf and behind your hamstring, when they come into contact with each other, that actually reduces the contact forces between the patella and the femur and the tibia. So you reduce the contact forces within the knee, you adjust to it, you get into the bottom, you have that little bit of compressive force. Now you can get yourself to spring off just that tiny little bit so you can get that initial upward movement. And then from there, it's all you.
For sure.
It's just a different amount of how much you get there. So having a sleeve, you're not really going to have another plate get put on the bar.
Yeah.
It's not happening. You put on wraps and you wrap them tight enough, you for sure are. You are for sure getting a plate.
That's really
interesting. Wrap them a little bit lighter, you'll get somewhere between nothing and a plate. Just about. And that's going to accommodate you almost like doing a reverse banding.
Yeah.
Like a half squat or something.
Yeah.
It only helps you just enough if you do it right. So you can get that initial movement and you take a little bit of pressure off the joint in the very bottom. And then everything else is you. And the goal is to make the entire range as hard as you can without being bottlenecked by your one weakest position.
That's really interesting. So when you're programming people, sorry, I'm properly going off on a tangent now, but this is what happens on these podcasts. People are aware of it. When you're programming people then, would you actually make them, like say they're going to be doing a barbell back squat? Yep. Would you actually make them do a complete raw barbell back squat so you can analyze their complete pattern from their head, their neck, their spine, all the way through to their hips and things like that, and before you allow them to use any other sleeves?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that I've started doing recently, because I've got a background of powerlifting as well, so I'm a bit of a hybrid of powerlifting and bodybuilding. When I was doing my bodybuilding squats and I was using my sleeves, I actually thought to myself, I'm going to take them off and see what I can actually do without it. Now, the same kind of weight that I can squat without sleeves, for example, or sorry, the same weight I was putting on the bar and I was squatting without sleeves, I actually felt my quads more than I did do when I was wearing sleeves. So now I just do not wear sleeves at all unless I'm going to be going on a hack squat or a pendulum squat.
Fair enough.
So why would you feel, or why would you see, if you were programming me and I said that to you in terms of feedback, why would you think that that would actually be the case? Why would I feel my quads more, for example, without the sleeves?
Very likely because the sensation of you getting that muscle to lengthen is one of the stronger neural stimuli. Mm-hmm. So when you're going through a movement, the two more extreme positions, being the shortened or the most lengthened positions, are going to be the most notable for you at any point in the sensation of the movement that you're doing, especially under load. So if you're getting fully lengthened under load and you're getting a little bit of a deloaded off of you, so where you should be getting into that fully lengthened position at the quad and having that full resistance being placed only within the quad and not having it being displaced by any other thing, which would be the case on a naked knee. Yeah. You're going to have the sensation of getting that quad fully lengthened, and there's no way that you could obfuscate the forces that are being placed on it anywhere else for you to have any of that sensation drop off. As long as you're having the same control and the same cadence roughly throughout those positions, you're not going to have a ramping down of the sensation of what's going on at that muscle or at that joint. You have the knee sleeve where as you're getting into that fully lengthened position, you pass that mid-range and into the bottom where you're starting to get that back contact between the hamstring and the calf, or at least the padding that's on them from the knee sleeve. As you're getting into the fully lengthened position there, when you should be having the very strong sensation of the load going through that lengthened position of that muscle, you're going to have a little bit of those forces being obfuscated into the compression of the knee sleeve. So as that sensation is supposed to be ramping up pretty sharply, it's getting, dropped off a little bit. Instead of hitting its total peak, it's going up and then kind of tailing off and then coming back up again as you start the rep.
Got you.
So that would be what I would say. That, or just having the mental security of having the sleeve where people can use that as, oh, I'm safe. Yeah. And they stop thinking about like, oh, my knees are going to hurt, or what am I doing with them? Like, am I cueing in the right place? For whatever reason, we put a sleeve or we put wraps on and you no longer think about what's going on. And if that's what you're doing and you'd be more cautious with a naked knee, you're likely going to slow it down a whole lot more and be a lot more deliberate with what's going on. And therefore, because you are more conscious and more deliberate of what's happening, you're going to feel it a little bit more. The sensation will be stronger. because you're focused on it.
Yeah.
If you're wearing a sleeve and you flip it the other way and you start thinking like, oh, I have a sleeve, I don't have to worry about it. Your tempo starts to change. You just kind of like drop a little bit faster into it. You're not decelerating the load as you hit the bottom. You're just falling into it because you know you have a sleeve and you're safe.
Yeah.
So you drop in and then you just take the rebound as soon as you can take it. You're going to feel the quads a whole lot less.
Absolutely. Psychology's got a huge impact into it, doesn't it? It's like people when they wear belts and they're like, well, my back's not going to hurt because I'm wearing a belt.
Yeah.
And that really, really tips me off, you know, because it's just like, oh, it's got nothing to do with your back. But yeah, so
that's a whole other one too.
Oh God, it's so annoying, isn't it? It's just like, oh, I wear a belt because I have a bad back. Well, it's not going to do anything for your back. If anything, it's going to make it worse. But
yeah, exactly. It's only likely going to make it worse. And that's one of the biggest things that I have a struggle with people that do come to me early. Like a fresh client that comes in that's wearing a belt on all their top sets, like you said, with the sleeves and the wraps and everything for squatting. One of the first things that I do, I'm a little bit less concerned with people wearing a sleeve and me looking at their mechanics for their squat with a sleeve than I am looking at any movement whatsoever while they're wearing a belt.
Yeah.
Almost bar none, when I have somebody come to me that's using a belt on their lifts, everything is off. Everything. Because what I tend to see is a trend towards everything moving super linearly when somebody has a belt, as opposed to actually having respect for the rotational aspect of every movement that goes on, especially every compound movement. So what I mean by that is when somebody's wearing a belt, you tend to see just a little bit more counterproductive, counterintuitive to what most people wearing a belt would say, protecting their back. The majority of the time, when somebody's wearing a belt, you see them more lumbar flex than they would have been without it.
Yeah, for sure.
Every time. Because they start to try and like almost push their lower back into the belt. So you're already putting yourself in a more dangerous position by wearing the belt in the first place. And then two, usually it's tight too much.
Yeah.
So it's locking you down so you actually can't create adequate intra-abdominal pressure, which is the whole point of it anyway, which if there's any case to be made for how it's actually saving your lower back, quote unquote, it's because you're having adequate intra-abdominal pressure enough for you to stabilize the spine from the front. But if it's too tight, you can't do that. But that's exactly what you do when you're trying to protect your back.
Yeah.
When you look at it as a physical obstruction to save the structure from, like, I don't know, like shooting out of you and like landing across the room somewhere. Like that would be the only way that it would make sense to me. Like you're trying to almost like a rubber band it down so it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah,
it is
a weird one. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I was wearing a belt for powerlifting, and that is normally the time where I was wearing a belt. Now I have an issue with my particular bowel, so I have hiatus hernia and things like that as well. So I have an issue with bracing. So I've actually just started wearing a soft belt for some of my other movements rather than an actual lever belt.
Okay.
Which is what I was wearing for powerlifting and things like that. Now with powerlifts, it's completely different. So you can use that to create the abdominal pressure, like you were talking about, in order to stabilize yourself when you're doing those really heavy, disgusting lifts. For bodybuilding, it's completely different. So what do you see? Do you see, like, you know how we were talking about off seasons and optimal training modalities and things? Do you see as one of the things that people do have as an issue? So they use accessories too quick off the back.
Yeah. A lot of the time too, they're not used in the way that they should be, just like the belt being used as physical obstruction, or for bodybuilding, using sleeves or wraps just to put more weight on the bar. Usually that's not the greatest idea, especially fresh into an off season.
Okay. So why fresh into an off season? Why is that not a good idea?
So if you're coming off of another phase, being a dieting phase, rather than just maintaining, because I would more consider maintaining phase being part of the surplus phase.
Of course, yeah.
Rather than being a part of the dieting phase, depending on just how lean you were at the start of the dieting phase before the maintenance. But considering that being what it is, starting off in that phase, trying to use all of the tools that you have available to try and push up your numbers and your output over and above what you were capable of prior to, assuming that what you were at was already slightly depressed from your peak. You're trying to go from 80% of your peak ability from where you are post dieting phase into a maintenance and into a surplus, into an off season. you're trying to use tools to bridge the gap between where you were and where your peak is.
Yeah.
Instead of getting to your peak, maintaining that peak, and then trying to push against it until you get no more forward progress, and then utilizing a tool to help prop you up and then get you to make progress in the ranges that you can, and you still have the ability, while not being as bottlenecked by singular points of failure. That's where I see those tools being most helpful. So an example for what I do to periodize between sleeves and wraps for squatting would be when you go through multiple different squatting patterns, which is the way I would set it up, having them on a rotation based off of need and what patterns you most need the help for and what you're focused on as a primary strength goal over a longer block of time. You make that variation that you're actually using as your benchmark. You make that a secondary priority for the time. You push against it as the first exercise in the variations and the rotations that you do in the start of that season. Okay. You go until you cannot make any more forward progress in the primary rep targets that you're looking to do.
Okay.
After that point, doing it in a straight set method, doing a little bit of a rest pause type method is my second go.
Right.
Start using that same movement and going into the sets that you know that if your rep target is between 8 and 12.
Yeah.
So first set would be a 6 to 8 primarily for me, which is where I would focus most of my time. That doesn't make much progress anymore. Then you get into your down sets, being 8 to 12 or 12 to 15 plus. You're not really making any rep progress there either. You can't really wedge yourself up another 5 pounds. You can't just get any little tiny budges anymore.
Right.
At that point, then you either look to another variation or you create another variation by putting on a sleeve or a wrap.
Okay.
And then that variation of that movement ends up being able to prop you up past that singular failure that you had before. So where you're likely to fail is the point of the highest fatigue or the highest torque demands. So either in the stick point where you're at a 90-degree knee and a 90-degree hip, or at the very bottom.
Okay.
Those will be the two places you have those primary failure points on a movement like that.
Yeah.
So when you're going through the phase of trying to initiate and get that baseline and then start trying to push on your ability within it, you're going to hit a point where you just no longer can get any more progress. At that point, you add in the secondary variation of having a little bit of support in one of those primary failure zones.
Right.
Which
Okay.
sleeve can do at the very bottom where there's the highest torque demands. That's where you have that pushes you up a little bit, gives you a little bit more ability to move forward on it. You get maybe another rep or two. You maybe get another 5 or 10 pounds on the bar. Maybe you can progress on that, and that's just enough of a foothold for you to get another period of time where you have forward progress.
Right. Got you.
You take that until it can no longer give you anything. Then you can move on to something like a wrap. If there's no longer any forward progress that you can make, you can use that as a third variation of that base movement, where I would consider them variations of each other rather than being the squat than with a sleeve or with a wrap.
Got you. Okay. So why is it, this is just obviously, it's very interesting because obviously you're periodizing, applying accessories in order to help you in the same movement pattern. But why would you not, once you come to a stalling point, why would you not then swap, say, the front squat for a hack squat machine or a different variation completely rather than just adding an accessory?
You could. That is another method you could use. But that's primarily what having a double or a triple rotation of exercises would be for.
Yeah, sure.
So having the staple that is your primary baseline movement being in there and then the variations close to it thereof with the accessories, those are the main things that you're focusing on throughout. And then you have another secondary lift that doesn't tax you in the same way, that is very similar in pattern in the loading style, that will help to prop up what you can do with that over time in tangent to it. So you can run in parallel with the two of them. Then the other one that isn't really loading in the same exact way, that can be additive to how you're doing the pattern. It's just another variation available. So that could be a safety squat. They could be any sort of setting you do on a kabuki bar.
Yeah.
A hack squat. Literally anything that has you doing deep hip and knee flexion is going to help you in some way. It's just manipulating what you're doing within that. And that's going to be a little bit individual dependent and how they can tolerate their squats.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So a question then that I got recently, and I've obviously just blown it out of the water as well, so I want you to do the same thing. Do you have to squat in order to get big legs? And do you have to deadlift in order to get a big back?
Okay. Here's some nihilism for you. Not necessarily.
Okay.
You don't really have to do anything.
Mm.
Nothing specific ever needs to be a checkbox as something you really necessarily would have to do to make a thing happen. As far as hypertrophy is concerned, if you're talking to a real sports coach,
yeah,
somebody that's really tied in on the strength and conditioning, they will tell you, well, hypertrophy really isn't an adaptation. It's really just you building muscular callus over time.
mm-hmm.
And that's not exactly what we're looking at as far as like the specificity of what needs to happen to have that work.
Yeah.
For hypertrophy, the dartboard you're trying to hit, the bullseye is pretty wide, to be honest.
Yeah.
So you could pretty much just throw it in the general vicinity and it lands somewhere. You're gonna hit the target with enough points for you to somewhat be in the running to win the game.
Yeah.
You might not get it direct center, win the game right off the bat, but you're gonna get pretty close.
Sure.
So considering that, when we're really going through these, wait, hold on. Redirect me a little bit.
Redirect.
I'm going down the wrong path. Give me the question again.
Okay, so do you have to squat in order to get big legs? And do you have to deadlift in order to get a big back?
Okay, good. I was going the wrong way already.
Okay.
Yeah, I got too tied up in the nihilism. I went all the way in the other direction with that.
That's okay. You're doing what I normally do on the podcast, so it's fine.
Yeah, that happens too often. I have too many rabbit holes I can jump down if I want. So no, not necessarily. None of these things are direct checkboxes that you need to do.
Cool.
However, we way too quickly get nihilistic about that and decide that we have this range of acceptable answers and therefore any of them will do. It takes it too far.
Yeah.
So usually when people are saying you don't have to squat and you don't have to deadlift for you to get big legs or big back, I usually call that laziness.
Okay.
Because of the fact that most of the time, people that say that they can't deadlift or can't squat, that's usually the reason why we say you don't have to.
Okay.
We say that you don't have to do a squat or a deadlift or any of the variations thereof that are, mostly just compound. And we start going on to machines and other type of work that would replace it.
Yeah.
Those are viable options, of course. But those are usually the most viable options for people that have some sort of specific functional or structural limitation to their ability to do that movement well. If we have a client, like just as an example, a client that just comes up to us, fresh, we've never seen them do anything in their life before. They send their first form check video and they're already doing squats and deadlifts in their program. And they're flawless.
Yeah.
Are you going to go, we don't have to do squats and deadlifts. You're just going to go on the leg press and you're just going to do some chest supported T-bar rows and we're good.
Yeah.
No, if you have somebody that is, able to do it, you're going to do it. All right, let's go. Let's go. Let's lean in on that. But that person, all the time that they weren't going through trying to learn how to do those things, very, very few can just walk up to the bar the first time and just perfectly do it.
For sure.
So there was learning involved. There was learning how to use their body in the way that they should, how to get themselves set up in the way that works best for them, how they go through all the learning stages of getting able to do the thing, working through what their structural limitations and what their functional limitations are, and working on trying to bring up their function enough for them to outwork bad structure, for them to be able to do it well, or just learning it in general. You get through that stage, then you can use them as a viable exercise. And then the main considerations that have us say, well, you don't necessarily have to get a big back or big legs, squatting or deadlifting. Those are no longer conversations that we're having because we're not concerned for the fact that they're already so inaccurate with the movement that there's no way that they get any stimulus.
Yeah.
Or that they're going to hurt themselves.
For sure, yeah.
If those two things are out the window already, we don't think about it. We just go, all right, cool. Because the deadlift and the squat are still good movement patterns. And you do them well, and they fit for you, you're going to make some hypertrophy gains on it.
Yeah.
We already know that to be true. Like the difference between somebody deciding to do a conventional deadlift or an RDL or a stiff leg, there's not a big enough difference between those movement patterns to say that the deadlift, conventional, pure deadlift, is just automatically going to have a lot less hypertrophy benefit than the other two.
Yeah.
It's really not the case.
Mm.
Same thing for a regular barbell squat versus like a hack squat, where everyone likes to do the hack squat, which is a great movement. But if you're doing that in exclusivity to a barbell squat, and you just decided that because maybe the hack squat seems more optimal for no other reason than you really just haven't put in the work already to be good at squatting or to be good at deadlifting, then that's why I call it lazy. And that's usually where people go to start with, where they don't really know, and not to say that they're all lazy, but they don't know what to do first. They don't know, like, and I can say this pretty confidently at this point, because of the fact that I was one of those people that was like, I can't deadlift. I'm just not built for it.
Yeah.
I can't squat. I'm just not built for it. It's just not in the cards for me. And for anyone that doesn't really know me, my name is Nick Gloff. You can look at my Instagram. You look at where I'm at now, and not to pat myself on my own back, but you're not going to assume that I ever thought that I was not built to deadlift or squat.
Mm.
That's not going to be your first thought, I'm sure.
No, absolutely not.
So just as a case in point, I mean, I may be some sort of an outlier, which I'd probably assume to say that I am in one way or another. But at one point, I was the same guy saying, you don't have to. I don't have to, because the leg press is just fine. The hack squat is just fine. A Smith squat is just fine. It's all going to get me to the same place. So what does it matter?
Mm.
I did the same exact thing. But that was me not knowing that I could get around those structural limitations that were mostly functional limitations that I didn't understand how to work around and work with. So then I excluded myself from doing those things. And then as I worked through trying to bury my ego a bit and learn how to do those things properly, so I didn't have that sense of entitlement of, no, I'm special.
Yeah.
I just can't do those things. When I started to look at it and try to gain that ability, that's when the movement patterns for all of those other things I would have been doing as replacements started becoming more effective too.
Yeah.
Go figure. Because your basic function for the human body all ties into everything else.
Mm.
The function of one thing leads into the function of literally everything else from top to bottom.
Yeah.
In both directions, above and below. If one thing is a limitation for one movement, there's another way to use another variation to get around that specific one. But that's not really accounting for also the lack of efficiency that happens from that problem joint that you're trying to move around that is going to feed into the surrounding ones, which is always going to be consideration, and that's always going to drop your efficacy.
Yeah, yeah.
So working on trying to be better at them actually gets you towards the goal of being bigger and stronger anyway.
For sure, absolutely. I suppose one of the things that you've got to take into consideration is the fatigue to reward ratio based on the squat and the deadlift, because it is very highly fatiguing. So a lot of bodybuilders, I think that was the other thing that we wanted to talk about, was optimal recovery strategies. I mean, I know that we are coming up to time, so that may have to be like a secondary part. But if we're looking at recovery, especially for the off season, when guys are a lot bigger and, you know, a lot heavier and things like that, they're finding it more difficult to obviously do those higher rep ranges and things. Would you still realistically recommend them to do a higher rep range in things like squats and deadlifts because of the fatigue to reward ratio?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would. So the way that I would run my programming, I like to talk about it and give it a name.
Yeah.
Just intensity first training is the way that I would name it. Where the primary things that we're looking at is the effort intensity and the intensity of load. Yeah. Those are the first two things that I'm most concerned for. And then everything else, all the other variables that we're actually trying to manipulate within programming are secondary to that.
Got you.
So if your effort is always within a certain range close to your best, and the intensity of load is always within the very close proximity to being your best of your current capacity with any rep range that you're trying to target, those are the first two things that you're looking at all the time. Those are the primary bottlenecks that decide how much of everything else you get to manipulate. Okay. So looking at the variations of the exercises and the exercises themselves first as a primary base of the program before anything else gets imposed. Those are the start. Then from there, the amount of load within the rep ranges that you're doing, which is how you're going to decide that. And then the proximity to failure, which is always going to be very, very close to full failure.
Correct, yeah.
Those are always going to be in place. And then how much of all of those things that you're deciding to do is then going to decide the volume. And that volume gets decided from starting at a base at the minimum that you could get away with to have it be productive. And then seeing just how much you get out of it, how you can repeat those sessions, how much work you can actually tolerate within that movement structure, and then toggling it up from there. So if you're already starting with a base minimum and you know that effort is controlled for, the amount of exercises is controlled for, you're going to know that with that intensity of load, intensity of effort, and the exercises being there, there's going to be some place in there to make changes.
Yeah.
From that baseline, you're going to be able to tolerate a little bit more, a little bit less of this or that thing. If you get to the point where you start noticing that there's a specific drop-off in your ability to recover or perform in consecutive sessions following a certain movement or a certain session, then you look to either replace or remove, create a new variation for something that does have a high fatigue element to it, and try to replace it with something that does have a way to bottleneck you a little bit more, take load out of your hands and allow effort by your intensity of effort to stay high. You're still following the main tenets, but you've modified the variation so that you can continue to get the volume that's necessary to get the job done. And you're still staying within the same movement patterns of the session that you decided to start with. So for those people, especially being off season, and if you're big, small, male, female, doesn't matter so much that you're pushing, you're giving your best to whatever structure that you have. Within that structure, you make the changes necessary, but you always start with the fact that all the movement patterns are covered. All of the basic movements are there. The variations thereof are a little bit less important. A little bit less specific because individuals will need different things. Their abilities will tend them towards different things. Whatever variations that they have available, equipment-wise, all those other things start to go into the mix. But trying to shy away from things that have a high fatigue element, for the most part, that just also shies you away from the same exercise that has a large benefit to be gained by getting good at it.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be a trade-off, and there's one way of looking at it where there's also the debate between load being the primary thing for hypertrophy because of mechanical failure and the way that you get to that, or volume being the key driver.
Yeah.
Intensity of effort and intensity of load or volume being the things that we're looking at all the time. And that's always a debate with people standing on one hill or the other and trying to bomb the other ones out of existence.
For sure, yeah.
All the time. So that's one side of things. That's one argument. Then there's another one within that where for fatigue, recovery, performance management, trying to eliminate most compound exercises for machines or other assisted methods for you to do those same exercises or similar to doing the same patterns, trying to get the minimum amount of fatigue possible, but trying to get as much output as possible within those. It's a method that should be used in conjunction with using bigger movements, not with the exclusively using only machines and assisted methods to get yourself out of using compound moves. But that's another one of those two different hills, and they're trying to attack each other all the time and be completely exclusive to one.
Yeah.
If you're missing one or the other, you're not going to put all the pieces together in the way that you should be. And there's a whole lot more on the table. If your main movement for your back over time is a chest supported T-bar row, and you're not already 300 pounds, you're missing it.
Yeah, for sure. You're not going to work that lower back at all.
No. And actually, the majority of all of the musculature of your back is not going to get a ton of stimulation from having you sit yourself on a pad and just move your elbows around.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a whole lot more involved. And the primary purpose and the function of the muscle tissue on the back is to provide stability to the pelvis, to the spine, and the rib cage.
Oh,
And then following that, as you move up,
have you had those people who have said to you that they will not deadlift because they have a bad back, and you see them just sat down all the time and they have like weak glutes and tight hip flexors and rounded shoulders, and it's just like, oh, for God's sake, just pick up a bar.
Yep. So actually, the majority of the time when I have people come to me and part of their initial consultation with like, there's a part on the consult form.
Yeah.
To say what movements work well for you, what movements are there to be avoided in your program. Majority of the time, there is squat, deadlift of one kind or another in the do not program section.
Yeah.
You know what I usually program in the start?
Yeah.
Yeah. I usually look for exactly the thing that they say they can't do, and they go, no, we're gonna do that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show you that you're not nearly as broken as you believe you are.
Yeah.
And you're much more capable than you ever thought you'd be. And this is how you actually get to the next stage in your progress, by taking away that self-limiting belief of, no, I could have once back in the day. I used to bench 365, but I can't anymore. I now just got to do machines. Or I used to squat and I was so good at it, but I mean, 225 and my knees start hurting.
Yeah.
Well, guess what we're going to do?
Yeah.
Because that sounds to me like you got to a certain point while just leaning in on your youth and your ability to feel like you were, not made of glass yet.
Yeah.
And then you just leaned into it until you couldn't anymore. And then the amount of runway you got from just, not caring and your body being resilient enough, they ran out. And then once you started to, you got to the point where considerations of how you're doing it became more important and you didn't know where to go anymore. And then that's where you abandoned it and gave yourself a justification of, no, maybe it just doesn't fit me, or no, I can just do these other things and I have a bad back, or I have a bad knee, or my ankles just don't move like that, or this, that, the other thing. I mean, there's literally any answer you could give to that. And there's always a justification for why or how. Usually it just comes down to, you got to the point where you needed to make adjustments and you didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So you decided no longer is that an option, when that just completely bottlenecks the progress you could have had on every movement with that same base pattern that you did to replace it in the first place. And hence why you have people that are forever intermediates.
Yeah.
And never really move forward. And that kind of ties back to the first thing that you asked me, even to say that the majority of the time when I have somebody come to me, they're bottlenecked by something so clear and obvious, but nobody thinks about it because they're thinking about all the other variables. And that goes into another thing we talked about with the science.
Yeah.
And this super specificity, but also this crazy nihilism over everything. Where it's, no, we want to make our program into this perfectly structured, this pattern followed by this pattern, but this reverse banded and this with a special cadence on it. I'm going to set up this prime machine in the perfect way with the weights exactly distributed on the 3 pins the way I want it to be. All these other little minutia, crossing over strength and resistance curves on every movement and thinking that's the only thing that matters. All of these little things that we decide to get super focused and dialed in on, those get all the attention, but nothing gets paid to just, are you moving right?
Yeah.
Are you just doing the thing well enough?
Exactly. And are you working hard enough in order to move right?
Yeah. Yeah. Working hard enough in order to move right, and then moving right enough for you to be able to work hard.
Exactly. That has to be the name of the podcast now, Nick. That's the title of the podcast. That's what it's going to be. That's all very clickbaity though.
That'll work. And
I know, right?
It works with my theme too.
It
Most
is.
people don't even know that.
I like that. So we're going to use that one. Right. Listen, we are just about up on time, but I am going to ask you the very final question, which is what I ask all of my guests. So I'm going to put you on the spot and you're going to be like, oh no, I should have really thought about that. If you could sit down and have dinner with 3 people, alive or dead, who would they be and why?
Ooh. Okay.
Told you.
Okay. Number 1, I think Nikola Tesla.
Okay, cool.
Because I have a firm belief that the technology and the world that we live in right now is just an artifact of the direction that we decided was the most lucrative for technology to go. So the current iteration of everything that we have kind of seems like it's the only logical direction that technology could have followed. Mm-hmm. But if you look into anything that he did, if anybody doesn't know who he was a madman to start with, but also a crazy inventor that had a lot of amazing ideas that even to now, like, we don't understand everything that he did. Yeah. And it just took a completely different look at what we were going to do with technology. And we went totally another direction, and here we have landed. Mm. So to have a conversation with somebody that had not been already pigeonholed and boxed into the way that we already currently understand technology to have worked, and had a completely other perspective and another way of looking at it, another way of conceptualizing and creating a new pathway forward for where everything could have gone, to have a conversation with somebody like that, to get some of those, like, just to break the box that we're all in with the way that we see the world, would be incredible.
That would be pretty cool.
So that would be number one in my case, I think. Now, 2 and 3 would be harder. I think to pay respects to bodybuilding, being that it is basically my whole life. Sure. I would love to have a sit-down conversation with Dante Trudell, and Dr. Scott.
Of course, you have to have Dr. Scott. Yep. I have multiple conversations with Scott because he's been on the podcast, got at least like 6 times or something like that now, which has just reminded me. I think I must give him a message and we'll get him back on again. Just basically, you have to have a conversation with Nick, just because that would be cool.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Scott is the man. I've been following stuff that he's done forever. I have his Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. Yeah. Like, love to support the guy. I've been listening to him talk on the Advices Radio podcast for years.
For sure.
Like, he's the man. Dante, of course, is the godfather of everything effective within bodybuilding.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely.
So, and the fact that he's one of those guys that hasn't gotten too tied up in the Instagram and the social media. Yeah. He's got a little bit of like a personal mystique. Like, you can't reach the guy really. He reaches out when he decides that he wants to come out. Yeah. You know, he's in his cave all the time. And then he comes out maybe to say hello to the world every once in a while, but for the most part, he's just disappeared somewhere. He's one of the very few that still lives that way, and that gives him that little bit of extra.
That's it. It's just like that
cool talk.
Yeah, that mysterious edge. I love it. Okay, Nick. Well, listen, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Guys, if you want to follow Nick, I'm going to give all of his Instagram and all of his socials and his website underneath the video as per usual. If you've got any questions, then again, just please put them on and we will get back to you as soon as possible. If you like the podcast, give us a like and a share as per usual. And thank you once again for listening to another episode of us bash on about anecdotes and science. And we will catch up on the next episode. Nick, thank you so much again for your time, my man.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.